Ah,
There we go. Oh, did it ask for consent or no?
it said got it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so to start off with, would you like to say your name and where you are, please?
Oh, and where I work?
Where you are.
Where I am. I'm Zevy. I'm in New York City, in Chelsea, where I've been since 1975. So I'm one of those archaic dinosaurs that have stayed in the same place.
Huh. So the first question is, who are you as a human being, not as a dinosaur? But that can be anything you'd like to share in terms of your values or your passions or qualities about yourself.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody recently about the trajectory of who I became, because what I started out with was very different from who I am now. I mean, there are basic philosophies that have continued throughout, but the ability to exercise them or to live in my skin that inhabits a certain way of looking at the world and raising righteous people meaning people whose concern for others and the environment and the planet as a whole is sort of centrally focused. And one of the things I decided a long time ago was that one of the goals of therapy was to encourage people to become righteous. And to a large extent, it's worked. So I do feel very satisfied about the work I've done. And that's sort of the central philosophy that I live by.
Can you say a little bit more about that raising righteous people? How does that play out for you, or how is that in yourself?
Well, mostly people who come to see me have a central moral fiber of paying attention to others and of doing good works. Because I'm an activist, because I'm a lesbian activist, I attract a certain clientele who want to live outside the box of materialism and find ways to spend their time either donating to others, helping others, working on the environment, trying to save the planet, or at least ranting and raving about the state of the world. And then we can work on, okay, where do you want to put your energy?
So seems beyond obvious to say that social activism is a large part of how you live and how you practice?
Yes, pretty much, sure. That would be a central focus. Absolutely. But it's also about the totality of what the planet consists of. What I believe is that the chaos that we're living in now is an attempt, and the jury's out at this point as to whether we will succeed or not, of moving us to one planet, that national lines will break down, country lines, ethnic lines, and we'll go to one planet as a human planet. And so the designation of the label will be human first, and then we can say, we're this, we're that, we're this, but it's not something we fight over. It's not something we fight over. Whether we'll succeed as a planet is anyone's guess. It's hard to tell at this point in time, and I doubt whether I'll live long enough to see it. But I believe that's where most of the chaos is coming from right
now. So a pretty large set of paradigm shifts.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we don't do that, we're not going to succeed as a species. And if we do that, we have we have a chance.
Mhm.
Have a chance. But the fact is that the solutions to many of our problems can come from any corner of the globe at this point. And we need to not only honor that, but foster it. And to do that, we have to become one planet.
So could you speak a little bit to some experiences or some of the circumstances of your own life that have led you to have some of this clarity and this orientation?
Well, I grew up in a sort of combined family of repression and activism. So there was a lot of attempts at authoritarianism, with my parents fighting a good deal of the time. Both of them sort of equally. It wasn't that one had more power than the other. It's that they fought over their differences, basically. My mother was the activist. She'd always been an activist. She was a union person. My father was a fireman who then became a psychotherapist and had been in the Navy as a corpsman. Never talked about his experiences. So we had no idea where he lay in terms of certain political ideologies. But my mother also wanted to work. And that was one of the major fights because she brought in extra money. Both of them had pretty severe emotional difficulties from their own childhoods. So things got pretty chaotic at times. I landed on the side of, more on the side of my mother in terms of the activism, on the side of my father because he was a nature lover. And he would take us to the botanical gardens, he would take us to the museums. We were exposed to a lot of wonderful things. We always had animals, we always raised tadpoles. The house was a constant haven of activity. One time, my father, who was in social work school, was in a lab and he brought home a white rat who was pregnant. She had babies and we painted their tails so we could tell them apart. And they scurried around the house until one by one they disappeared. But I was raised with a love of what was available in nature and amongst people and amongst animals. And that sort of became part of the foundation. And then I started becoming an activist. Well, I guess as soon as I realized that I was gay, that came after having a couple of relationships. You know, when you decide that something fits, you try it out first, you experiment. So I did a bit of experimenting, but the activists came around civil rights. And I was active in protests. I saw the relationship between the police and African Americans, which we didn't call them that in those days, of course. That was a later development. And I didn't go down south to protest because I was not a believer in nonviolent protests.
You would have got yourself into some trouble.
Definitely. Would have ended up either in jail or dead.
Mm. Funny, I just heard Nina Simone say the same thing in an old interview.
Yeah, I could not have stood there while I was, hit or tortured. Couldn't have.
Yeah.
And, I realized that one day, and we were protesting ABC Studios, and it was nighttime, and the police rode in on their horses and knocked over a pregnant woman, and I came this close to leaping up and dragging him off the horse, and I realized that was really dangerous. I had to direct my energies in a way that, was a little safer. And that's what I did. So I went from civil rights to, the women's movement, to gay rights, and until I found Identity House, which is where I landed as an activist. And along the way, I was trying to figure out what to do. I always leaned toward social work as part of activism and as part of, helping people. And, but I couldn't find really a home and I did a lot of speaking. I did a lot of workshops and seminars, and, a variety of different topics until I found Identity House. And that's sort of the home I landed in, because that it fed a lot of the different interests that I have. So I was working for the city as a caseworker, and painstakingly, a friend of mine, Michael, was there, and we painstakingly came out to each other. And both of us were interested in getting involved in something. Initially, we went to Pennsylvania to look at an organization called HELP, which is sort of a central resource for people calling in who had problems, and then they would direct them towards different organizations. We came back to New York thinking that we might start something like that. But he heard from his therapist that a group of, now this was after Stonewall, so Stonewall was 69. This is around 1971. He heard from his therapist that a group of therapists were getting together to put together a counseling service for the LGBT. In those days, it was LGB community. And they were looking for volunteers. So Mike and I went, and at that meeting, Patrick Kelly, Karen Humphrey, both fellows of the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy, were there directing the building of the organization towards along Gestalt therapy theoretical and practice lines. Meaning, to avoid bureaucracy, to avoid hierarchy, of keeping it rather laissez-faire, keeping it interest-oriented, that when people had an interest, they would volunteer. And Identity House was put together along the same lines as the New York Institute. So initially, we opened in late 71, and then the director, who was then Chuck Silverstein, decided that he wanted the organization to be professional. So and mind you, Identity House was founded as a walk-in center where people could walk in off the streets and find a peer counselor, someone like themselves to talk to. What was extraordinary, of course, was that we started in a church basement and people would walk up and down, up and down, up and down before they had the courage to come in to talk to somebody. We started off very slowly because in those days you advertised in the Village Voice, you put flyers up. We were a very unique counseling service. Many of our members were involved in changing the nomenclature of homosexuality from a pathology.
Mm-hmm.
And these were the psychologists and the psychiatrists who were going to their various professional organizations and changing things. So Chuck sent around this letter and the organization split because we were interested in keeping it along those lines. Pat Kelly and Karen, sided with us. Two women, Sydney Abbott and Barbara Love, who had the smarts, flew up to Albany and reserved the name Identity House and gave it to us. So then we had to form a new organization. And we started, having meetings. None of us knew what we were doing. We were winging it. But we met.
Actually responding to the needs, right? Rather than sort of doing that cut and paste what's already out there that's not working.
Exactly. And we put together a revolving organization that now is in its 50th year. We're about to have a gala celebration because it still works. So the model works.
Mm-hmm.
Institute survived, Identity House survived. The model works. There are things it doesn't do well because it's not a hierarchy, but it survives and it provides the service it was intended to do.
And how is that for you to say that 50 years later?
Amazingly gratifying. I love the kids coming in who are running things. I've stepped back. I'm sort of an emeritus. I sort of steer the organization along the same lines when they start to run into trouble, because these young adults, their 20s and 30s, are very accomplished. They're lawyers, they have MBAs. It was the complete opposite. We were completely untrained at that point. But we were willing to offer our stories to help others. That's what we had to offer. We had our experience and our stories. And over the years, Identity House went through major changes, as most organizations do. And I stepped out, I stepped back in, I stepped out, I stepped back in. But around 1972, 73, I was in a supervision group with Karen, and they started to talk about the Institute. Pat Kelly and Karen started to talk about the Institute, and I became intrigued. Up until then, I had gone to a lot of psychoanalytic meetings. I was in a psychoanalytic group. It wasn't working for me on two levels. One, it was based on a medical model, and two, it was homophobic to an extraordinary degree.
Those are pretty significant levels.
Right. And all of a sudden, I found a place, the New York Institute, that was the only institute probably in New York that was not only open, but encouraging of people to be whatever they were. And was founded on the notion of creativity and growth. So I started attending Institute meetings. At the same time, I had become more involved in Identity House, and around 1975 started to go for my master's degree. So there was a lot going on. Coupled with the fact that in 67, I met Lucy, and over the years, we built a very strong, although often contentious relationship. As many relationships are.
Mm-hmm.
Because we were very different people. She was a science person. She was a logical person. She was a person that didn't go into feelings. And of course, I was the complete opposite. So it took us a long time to work that out, which we did. So all this was going on at the same time. It was a very exciting time.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask, who some of the strongest influences on you were from any of those areas?
Well, certainly Lucy was one of the major.
Mhm.
My parents were, I have to, say my parents were very strong role models for certain things and not for others. Lucy was a huge influence because she was comfortable in certain ways that I wasn't. She was very comfortable socially and I wasn't. I didn't realize until years and years later, probably around the 80s, that I had a serious case of ADHD and had always had trouble in certain ways, particularly in school, that were attributed to behavior problems. So I never understood because it wasn't part of anybody's understanding in those days that there were just things I couldn't do. And I needed help in certain ways that was not available. But Lucy didn't have those problems. So she was comfortable in, because what happens is when you have certain problems, you start to shrink back socially. Because you're not quite sure if you're getting it right. You're not quite sure if you're going to be yelled at or you're going to be judged in certain ways. Because you
Okay,
can't.
also it's that feeling of just being different, whether you get the result done or not. It's the process and the being is different.
And then people don't believe it because you're bright. So they don't believe that you have problems in certain areas. So not only was Lucy a major influence in that way, but she had a moral center that was unequivocal. This was right, this was wrong. And I was raised with a lot of gray. So it was interesting to watch the way she operated with this kind of moral center when things weren't great for her. So she was a major influence in that way. She also could do things that, in other words, she would play chemistry games with, we met at French Hospital, by the way. We both worked there and I was a very bad secretary while I was finishing school. And
Imagine being a secretary with ADHD is also hard.
right, definitely hard. And she always had physical problems. She had a severe osteomyelitis when she was 3. It affected her left leg and she always had trouble. So there was a period of time when she was having difficulty and I used to go down to her lab and help her in certain ways. And one thing led to another and I started to be interested, even though she was nothing like anybody I had ever been interested in. And periodically I would think, why am I interested in her? But there was a quality of excitement around her that never changed. Never changed. So, we I don't know as I'd call it dating, we sort of got together over time. So she was a major, major influence growing up. Patrick Kelly, Karen Humphrey, Richard Kitzler sort of became my mentors. Richard in particular became a mentor. The Institute changed my life because not only was it a place where people could argue points of theory, sometimes, sometimes with an intensity that was troublesome. But I'd never been in an environment where people could argue points of theory and practice in a way that made sense to me. So at some point I said to Patrick, I wanted to study with him. And he said, well, put a group together. So I asked different people who were in and around the Institute, Michael being one of them. And we all started in a practicum with Pat, who mumbled something terribly, but had an incredible gift for working with people, an incredible gift. Karen, who was probably one of the most integrated as far as the theory and practice was concerned, and sort of stayed under the radar, was absolutely brilliant when it came to that. And so she and I became very close friends over the years. And she and Lucy and I became very close friends. And suddenly I was involved in a community and a network. So the community was not only Identity House, but it was also the Institute. And there was an interface that moved back and forth, a very permeable, osmotic interface where people would come and go. And that really suited me. I could step back when I needed to. I could be engaged when I needed to.
And these are personal and professional ties.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so there was an interface between the personal and the professional. I was doing a lot of LGBT activism at that point. Started going to marches, started giving workshops and lectures. Was going to the Gay Academic Union, because at that point after Stonewall, all these organizations burgeoned, started growing in leaps and bounds. And so not only did I have a community and a home, but it extended into other areas. And so there were other people who were very influential who came and went. There were psychologists at Identity House who were working in academia to change things. And up until then, I had been under the impression, of course, that the academy, corporations had to be destroyed in order for things to change. And suddenly I was meeting people like Hal Cooten, what was his name, Brad, can't remember his last name, who were working within the academy to change things. And things were starting to change.
Sort of that slow transformative revolution instead of the
right,
burn it down.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So up until then, I was pretty much a rageaholic. I used rage in order to do a lot of activism, and I started to, of course, I was in therapy at that point also. I had two kind, intelligent therapists, both of whom were psychoanalysts, and I had to start changing my views on that also. That psychoanalysis did not have to totally be destroyed. There were people within it who could change things. So Rose Rieger was the first therapist I went to. And she was sort of a family therapist. She was almost a family grandmother, because my father had seen her, my mother had seen her, my sister saw her, I saw her. And she became almost an extension of the family. She was Viennese. From Europe, had come here on a fluke, just as Germany was closing down and Austria was closing down. And she had a European way of looking at things. For example, she would say, I don't understand this American need to be stuck together all the time. She said, my husband and I, we have separate bedrooms and we go on separate vacations. And it suddenly, a world opened up. And Lucy was more European also than she was American, having grown up in a European Italian family that had immigrated here. So she had a sort of a European way of looking at things also. And suddenly that opened another important insight about the way different people operate. And I was intrigued. I was intrigued because to a large extent in my family, this was this and this was that. You know, there was a lot of judgment. I was raised with a lot of judgment. And it wasn't working for me. So suddenly I was involved in a community and exposed to people who had different ways of perceiving and different ways of looking at things. And also had an easy way of being in the world. And I didn't.
Not quite so much fighting.
Right, not so much fighting. Right. So over the years, I started to calm down. I started to calm down and to see that there were other ways of accomplishing the same goal.
I think the little I know of you is that it's a sustained sort of controlled burn. It's not put out by any means.
Now it is. And in the old days, it wasn't.
Yeah.
I could be quite volatile.
Just a random anecdotal question. Did you manage to go through that period without actually getting arrested, or did you get picked up at some point?
Oh, no, I was very careful not to get arrested because I knew it would be dangerous for me.
Okay. Yeah.
Really dangerous because I couldn't control my temper. And so I might be in jail and be manhandled, and that would be really dangerous. So even today, when I protest, I stay on the outer edges, because the one thing I will blow over is torture, mistreatment, abuse. I don't control my temper around those things. It's hard for me. I can't take a laid back attitude.
Did your career as a caseworker in New York last long with that issue?
Yeah, it was a case where, well, that changed because after graduate school, I became a medical social worker. I had different roles that I played, but one thing remained was the degree to which people were being mistreated always stuck with me. Always stuck with me.
So can I ask how you have come to, understand and experience some of the complexities of yourself in terms of gender and that aspect of your identity?
Right. Well, my view of myself is not complex. I don't equivocate on the fact that I'm a lesbian, and I relate to women in a certain way. And if I walk into a room, I'm going to look at the women, not the men. And that's sort of a given. So there are certain things about myself that are not gray. How do I live in a gray world where most decisions as adults are gray? They're not black and white. That took a long time to understand and to figure out how to deal with. That we live in a very complex world. For example, people, talk about wanting to destroy corporate America. And I say, yeah, but corporate America funds most of the nonprofits and most of the charities. How do you want to handle that? They donate millions and millions. Yeah, but they get tax breaks. That may be true, but they fund the organizations, and the organizations exist and they do good works. How do you want to handle that? Now that's a kind of gray complexity that's no longer black and white. And when I grew up, it was. The unions were right. corporations were wrong. Life's not like that anymore. Another gray area is the proliferation in identity labels that changes almost every day, almost every week. My own personal belief is that the kids are going to eliminate gender as a serious construct at some point. People again will be humans, you know.
More of the unifying versus the subcategorizing kind of.
There'll be men and women if that's what they choose, but it's not going to have the overarching intensity of meaning that it does now. Because the 20-year-olds, the late teens, the early 30s, don't care about that in the way that we were raised to care about it. But it's complicated. It's very complicated.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of people don't want to use they.
It's really not that hard.
No, it's not. It's not.
Mhm. So how about your age, Lee? How are you with this phase of your life and this process?
Well, this year I turned 80. I can't believe it. Every morning I wake up and I
Great.
can't believe it. And I'm having a huge belated birthday party at a gallery that a friend is throwing for me because she's intrigued with lesbian elders. So she did this whole art project on lesbian elders, one of which I was fortunate enough to be. I also, I think because of my age, just finally won a Lifetime Achievement Award for my work as an activism. And I think it has something to do with age. So there are benefits to being this age. So it depends on, my aches when I wake up in the morning as to whether I like it or not. Mostly I don't think about it. As long as I can do the things that I love doing. And after the accident, I went back. I'm back working. And I love working. I love seeing the clients. I love seeing the variety of people and what they're doing. I love being able to help. So that's my passion. And it doesn't have the same meaning. When I was in my 30s and 40s, I thought, oh my God, I don't want to grow old because I'll have to wear polyester dresses and clunky shoes because that's what older women wore. When I realized I could wear anything I wanted, my whole view of being older changed. So one of the things 80 gives me, of course, is heft. People often want to know what I think and, the trajectory of what I've accomplished. For instance, when the pandemic hit, I was able to tell people I'd been there before, right? I lived through polio. I lived through Vietnam. I lived through Nixon. I lived through other horrors and difficulties. We can get through this. And that, to a large extent, calmed them down because everybody was thinking this is the end. But
Well, you were also in New York during the AIDS crisis, correct?
absolutely. Which the gay community relates to, a lot of other people don't. So it's interesting, yes. Definitely the AIDS crisis. And so, you have a perspective that's useful. It's useful to younger people to know that, you get past these things. I take more precautions these days. I don't ride the trains if I can avoid it at all costs. Because I don't want to be involved in any kind of incidents. And I know I might be if somebody is attacked on a train, I might step in. And that would be on the dangerous side. So I'm a little more careful about those things.
And, having gone through those circumstances and, sort of also tying back into where you are in stages of life kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts on loss and how that becomes, I mean, some people experience it very early, but
Well, I
it's
did.
a little bit more of a
My
theme.
mother died when I was 27. And what they said was the result of rheumatic heart fever, which I didn't know she had. But, you know, heart disease in 1969 was an entirely different prospect than it is now. So that was the first major loss. Lately, and it's only lately, it's catching up to me the number of people I've lost. Because up until recently, I would go from one to the other. So they were sort of like individual experiences. Now it's becoming a community of loss. So it's becoming wider and deeper. I lost Lucy in 2017, and around the same time, 4 other people that either she or I were close to. But the community itself, Identity House of the Institute, still was attacked. Lately, more people are becoming ill or infirm or coping with life-threatening illnesses, and it's becoming more widespread. So I haven't quite figured out how to integrate the fact, you know, where I can place myself within it. Also, this latest freak accident where I left the house at 10 o'clock in order to walk the dog and didn't end up coming home because I ended up in a hospital and then in a rehab for over 2 months, says, okay, you know, these things can happen.
Mortality is kind of right there.
It's not just mortality, it's also more disability. Mortality would be fine. Disability is not. Disability is not.
That actually requires adjustment. You're right, mortality. You don't have to do the adjusting.
Right, you don't have to do the adjusting, other people do. But adjusting to this and encountering tremendous age bias. Most of my friends who are my age are very active. In fact, one of them can do 3-hour spinning marathons. That's how fit she is. But the minute you encounter the medical establishment, they say, oh, how did you fall? I didn't fall. Because I got hit by a dog and smashed into a building. And they say, oh, then you fell. No, I didn't fall. I slid down. So, oh, at home, you walk with a cane or a walker. Neither. Oh, who takes you to the doctor? I do. And they look, because at 80, that's not what they expect. And so when I was when I was in the rehab, a friend who's a physician said, you have to make sure that they don't think you're a frail 80-year-old. You have to tell them what your life was and what you want to get back to. So that's what I started doing, that I was lifting 20 pounds a litter. I was taking care of the dog and walking him 3 times a day. I was walking 4 or 5 miles a day. I was working, and I had to start building a case for the fact that I was not a frail elderly person, because that is what they put on you the minute they see your age.
Yeah, the goals would be to get you back to their standard, not to yours.
Yes. And that was frightening. That was frightening, that I could be pigeonholed into something I wasn't.
That sounds like something to piss you off into a new phase of activism.
Definitely. I'm working on a piece about it that I want to have published. Because people don't realize what happens. And in fact, one orthopedist said, oh, you have osteoporosis. I said, really? I said, nobody's ever said that. He said, well, you wouldn't have broken anything if you did. I said, but I had a traumatic injury. He said, no, that wasn't traumatic. I said, what do you consider traumatic? He said, falling downstairs, falling off a building, or getting hit by a car. Other than that, it's not a traumatic injury. And if you didn't have osteoporosis, it wouldn't have happened. And what's the next thing? I have all these drugs I want you to take. So the first thing in the hospital was, I want to put you in a drug trial on an osteoporosis drug that's going to allow you, because I had a broken pelvis and a broken arm, allow your pelvis to heal 50% faster. Well, my pelvis healed within 3 weeks. I would have been on this drug for a year, and I would have had to inject it.
Wow.
And I looked at them and I said, you're crazy. Why would I do that?
Yeah, but it's interesting. It makes it basically an age-related
Yes,
injury.
yes. And people have to know that they have to fight against that. Otherwise, they're going to be pigeonholed. Otherwise, they're going to be.
So it's falling while 80 or breaking a bone while 80, not falling. Breaking a bone while 80 is kind of like driving while black. It's like
Yes,
there's a lot more emphasis put on one part of that than the other.
yes. It's an automatic. And it's automatic. What medications are you on? And I go through as needed, as needed, as needed, as needed. And they look at me. They get that Labrador look, you know? Like it doesn't fit. I should be on blood pressure meds. I should be on heart meds. I should be on this med. I should be. And you know, the frightening thing, I have my wits about me. People who don't are pushed right into these things. And of course, there's a relationship between the doctors and the drug companies. Of course there is.
So you not only see what's happening, you see the system. You are a dangerous lady, Lee.
Definitely see the system.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask what you would say about your experience or any aspect that you want to mention about power and privilege?
About power and privilege. It's very much more complicated than people want it to be. Much more complicated. I certainly understand what being white and, in fact, looking Irish growing up was about, except I was always afraid that the priests and nuns would steal me. They frightened me because they would look at me with that look like I belonged to them.
Yeah.
But
Just realized looking like an altar boy can be a very vulnerable position as well.
absolutely, absolutely. So I certainly understand what being white in this country is about. But privilege suggests something I don't relate to. I don't relate to. Because I had to work for everything I got. Painstakingly. It was not a picnic. You know, I had to have jobs that I hated, that I had to keep. I had to work with bosses who were horrors in order to keep, you know, earning money. School was difficult. Everything was difficult. And it wasn't that I set out to do certain things. It's just as the opportunity presented itself, I moved into the space. Yeah. I was on the wait list for graduate school. There just happened to be an opening at Fordham. So I went there. I was a lousy student. Got kicked out of college 3 times. Partially because other things were more interesting and partially because I couldn't do certain work. So it took me 8 years to get out of college, but I had to do it. if I didn't want to keep doing secretarial work, it was something I had to do. So there's ways in which I wish they'd come up with another word, that privilege.
Any suggestions?
No, I haven't come up with one yet, but I'm working on it.
That'll be the paper after the ageism one.
I'm working on it.
Okay. So getting back to the Gestalt side of you, that was how you came to the Institute. What would you say you found in Gestalt, in that part of that theory, that way of working, that way of being?
Well, first of all, we look for a modality that suits us personally. And the modality suited me personally, because it was experimental, because it was based in creativity and awareness, and because it was humanistic in a way that so many of the other therapies aren't. It's not that it was always practiced that way. There were always attempts at forming hierarchy within the Institute. And that's just the nature of human beings. And I want to separate things. It's the nature of male human beings. It's the nature of male human beings to a large extent. And we haven't quite separated female human beings from male human beings yet. So the New York Institute was very male-based. And because of that, there was a lot of testosterone that could fly around. But I carved out a space for myself.
Were you there after Laura? During Laura's
I was
time?
there during Laura, and I had difficulty with Laura because there was a meeting that we were all at, and I pointed out that the book, Gestalt Therapy, Human Growth, needed to be looked at because it was from the difference in a female perspective from a male perspective. And she said, there's no difference, and cut off the discussion.
The feminist critique of Gestalt theory died on the table there?
At that time, it came later when, as a group, we got together and started to show people some of the meaning of what it meant to be female in the Institute and how difficult it was to create space and how women operate differently. And it caused major changes to happen, major changes. But at that point, it was only the first couple of years I was going to meetings at the Institute and getting involved. I was on the executive committee as one of the students. But there were certain attitudes that were not movable at that point. We had to wait until the fellows no longer wanted to run things, and we changed the entire format. The entire format changed.
The fellows and the fellas.
Yep.
Hmm.
And the format changed to a more membership organization, so that the fellows were not the governing body, but the governing people would come up from the ranks of the membership. And that's what we've kept. That's what we've kept. So because there was flexibility in that way, although at times it seemed like there wasn't, I always found a place. Sometimes I would step back when it became sort of intolerable, or when things were going on that were too contentious. I could step back and then come back in when I was asked to present a paper on contacting, or something was going on that had opened up flexibility. So the Institute opens and closes and opens and closes. It's suited me because it was permeable.
Interesting. And what would you say is the essence of what you do? And you're still doing, combining all of these different influences and spheres and elements of your life.
That's a very open-ended question.
It is, but I mean, some people are like, well, and it's really clear. I work with this community. This is what I bring. You're not going to hear me talking about anything that doesn't involve, this. It's just really clear, that sort of identity piece of.
I've come to understand something in the last couple of months that I didn't understand. And that's probably the essence of who I am, but it came from the outside, not from the inside. Is when I had this accident and I put out an email that I was out of commission for a certain period of time. And I put it out to a number of different groups that I was involved in. The outpouring of interest and affection was huge. People I didn't even know existed. People came to visit me. People asked, could they bring stuff? Could they shop for me when I get back home? The concern, the affection was huge. I couldn't have imagined that around me exist people I have relationships with that I don't know I have. And that was eye-opening, totally eye-opening. That the way I am in the world has an effect, even if I don't know it. And I always knew that there were people in the background that are very important, because I have neighbors I've known for 40 years who are in the background. But the fact that people on the street, I would say hello to, or I would ask about their families, dog owners, was totally eye-opening. So I realized that I guess the essence I have at this point is the relationships I have and how important they are. And I couldn't have known that before this happened. And it's still happening. It's still happening. People I run into in cafeteria, the restaurant downstairs, people say, oh, you're back. It's so good to see you. One woman said, oh, if I hadn't seen you this week, I was going to run upstairs and see if you were okay. I just say hello to these people. I talk to them. I kibitz with them. It's not something I have, but something gets transmitted that's very important to them and therefore important to me.
Mm-hmm. So connection and community are definitely there.
When we don't even realize it's there.
I guess maybe that's something you create intentionally and unintentionally.
I used to create it intentionally. Now it's just everyday life. It's so integrated, I don't think about it anymore. And to a large extent, I learned this from Lucy, because this is how she was in the world. She would sit outside with the dog at her feet. Strangers would stop by, sit down, and she would ask them who they are. And they would open up. And that was the most pleasure she got as she got older. She couldn't do very much else, but talking to people, having an effect on them. And they would run across the street to help her carry packages. She had that kind of unconscious, because she never asked. She just had that way of being in the world. And I thought, that's the way I want to be.
Well, I wish I could have met Lucy, and I'm glad that I meet you. Every time I see you, I'm glad that I get to meet you again. It's nice.
Same here. I hear about you in the background. Oh,
yeah, no, I'm one of those, oh yeah, I knew about the fall, and well, not the fall. I knew about the wall, the dog, yeah. Yep. So what are some of those memories? I don't want to miss that little storytelling opportunity, especially within the Gestalt world in particular. What are some of those things that stay with you? Because some people can remember, like a phrase that was said in a therapy session 50 years ago, and they can tell you what they were wearing because it was just such a huge insight for them. I don't know, what stays with you?
So I was with a group of people at Patrick's Practical, and we sort of knew that you work with somebody for a period of time, and at some point when they think you're ready, you become a full member. So I hadn't been giving much thought to it, and I was in graduate school, almost finishing, and I came to a meeting one day, and I was with Gloria Wilson, who was another member of the group. And Richard came over to us and he said, I put your name in for full membership and it was accepted. And it was like, what? What? It was like, I couldn't take in what he was saying. Because it meant acceptance in a way that I had never experienced.
Yeah, full membership.
It meant I could teach. It meant I could be faculty. It opened up a world that I had never expected, because I was always the kid with difficulties. I was always the kid who, I remember in kindergarten, they were giving out these paper dolls, and the teacher would ask who wanted them, and everybody would raise their hand, of course. And and of course it was girls, not boys. And all the girls got these pretty dolls, and then there was one doll left that was not pretty, and that was the one given to me. And that was my expectation, that somehow I would get the ugly doll. So when Richard came over and said, you've been accepted as a full member, it was like somebody gave me the pretty doll. And so.
Wow. I'm glad they did. So what do you think is going to happen with Gestalt? Where do you see it going? And where are you going with it?
Well, I'll stay with the Institute as long as I can. The Institute is no longer the Institute I grew up with. I think, I'm not sure how many countries don't have a Gestalt Institute at this point. We are so worldwide.
So far, the Humans Project, we've managed to find 53 countries.
53 countries. So.
That's actually not that many.
You're right. I guess it's, that at meetings or, at conferences, there were so many people from so many places, it seems like they're all over. But 53, you're right. But even 53 compared to one.
Yeah, if it started with, 2 or 3 people, 53 countries is not bad. We have a ways to go, though.
And my push is to utilize that by having people outside the Institute take positions, administrative positions. There's no reason we can't have people become president, treasurer, secretary, who are not part of the Institute, because we work online. There's a lot of pushback on that. There's a lot of pushback about leaving New York, But I think it's the way we're going, and it's important. It's important. And there are certainly capable people out there. Presentations are coming in from all over now. Because, Zoom and the internet make it all possible. And so I think that's, part of my plan to humanize and globalize the planet. And I think Gestalt therapy is one way of doing that because of its focus on relationality. And so I'm all in favor of. I was having difficulty in the beginning when Dan proposed bringing in, some members from Europe. But he was right. He was absolutely right. And that's the direction we need to go in. Members of the Institute are working with people from the Ukraine and working with people from Russia. That's where the importance lies. So the more we can continue that, the more we can spread out, the better it is.
Well, would you add? I would. The spreading out and folding in, because it's not just about, that sort of colonial wave from the center outwards, but folding in.
Right.
Even if that changes the system.
Right. Right. Well, in this country, people want to be certified. And we're not a certifying institute. So they go to the other Gestalt therapy institutes because they give certifications. And we pick up the alumni, which is what we want. We want the alumni. So, but Gestalt therapy in this country is, I don't know where it is at this point. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. There are certainly people drawn to it. There are certainly institutes that are doing well. But also we're an Asian population. And so it depends on what the younger people do. And I don't know what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. It's always been a puzzle to me. And I mean, this is just really sort of a side note at this point of the conversation, but why with such an identity focused sort of culture in America, there is no American Gestalt Association. And nobody's wanted to stick a flag on it and all sit down together and have that conversation. It's really kind of baffling.
Yes, and periodically we talk about that. I think the people who are interested would have to form it, and that takes energy. You're right. You're absolutely right. Why don't we have an American conference every year? Why don't we? Because somebody has to take it on.
Yeah. Having organized conferences, I know why people would want to not do that. But
AACP, when it first started, was that.
Yeah.
Right? Because Joe Weissong's organization was becoming increasingly authoritarian, I want to say. Even though when it started, I loved the conferences we had, Provincetown, other places, but AAGT was a breakaway and was, I guess, supposed to be an American institution.
Yeah, I think some people thought that it was, and so they didn't start working on making one that intentionally was.
Right.
But, yeah. No, I was just sort of picking up on that. You were saying earlier about sort of that, unification. Like, can we come together? Can we find this sense of community?
Right. But and it would be beneficial because the United States is so fragmented right now. It would certainly be beneficial to have an organization like that, where we could come together along certain principles.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, I'm, neither, I'm from above and I'm from below as a Canadian Mexican. So
right.
It's really not my issue, but it's just one of those, are you guys okay? Kind of things.
You definitely have a unique experience.
Yeah. I get to see my upstairs and downstairs neighbor from both perspectives. Kind of the Labrador look, I think you'd say.
Right. Right.
Like, really. But anyways, is there anything more about yourself or where you are or your projects that you would like to add at this point?
I still am drawn to the adventure. Every day there's an adventure of some kind, if I look at it that way. You know, right now, part of the adventure is going to physiotherapy and seeing if I can get my arm raised where it used to be, knowing it's never going to be where it was, and coping with that. But the adventure is what draws me. And so, you know, if we can keep things adventurous, if we can keep the Institute adventurous, if we can keep life adventurous, then we have something to look forward to. Half the time these days, I'm sort of countering, oh, everything is terrible. I even went so
An
far.
adventure.
Okay, if it's terrible, what do you want to change? What do you want to change? You know, I'm in certain ways a pragmatist. I stay very reality-based, but I'm also an optimist as far as, not an optimist that things will magically happen, but an optimist that human beings have an incredible amount of energy to shift things, And I see shifts going on all over. Iran, who would have thought Iran would be in this kind of shift? Somebody just announced today that China has police stations in 21 countries. And they are convincing dissidents in those countries to go home by threatening their families. That's one of the things going on, which we could look at and say, oh my God, that's horrible, which it is. But there's an organization that found that out. A small nonprofit organization devoted to finding out that information and sending it to the rest of us. That to me is adventuresome. That to me is where we focus.
Interesting. It is definitely an adventure to spend some time with you, that's for sure. I would like to be more in touch with you, Lee. I do want to apologize for only having those usually event sort of oriented communications, because I am one of those who I appreciate you very much. So thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
And is it okay for you then if we leave this one here?
Yeah. I look forward to cringing at the preview.
I don't think so.
Which most people do.